Okay, so today we're going to start talking about the Marshall Plan. But before we can do that, we have to get into some contextualization. So World War II ended in 1945, and coming out of that, many European economies were in shambles. And Germany is a poster child for this because their economy was so bad, they actually started using tobacco as currency because the Reichmark was so useless. So that's certainly one example, but not the only one. And the US was uniquely positioned to help other countries because they were the only world power at this point that was not economically crippled after World War II. So if they wanted to help out, they certainly could. And the events that happened in the subsequent years of 1946 and 1947 kind of pushed them in that direction because you have a bunch of other European economies, for instance, Greece, who are certainly struggling. And Greece was in the middle of a civil war at this point. They were teetering, in the US's view, on the edge of going to communism, and so that prompted then President Harry Truman to authorize his Truman Doctrine and send aid to both Greece and Turkey. Another example of a bad economy would be Czechoslovakia, which had just succumbed to a communist coup right in this time period. And so basically, the US is starting to see the writing on the wall and kind of decides that they need to get involved. And this all is under the bigger umbrella of the idea of containment, which is obviously to contain the spread of communism. And so that was first done in the Truman Doctrine, like I said, and the Marshall Plan is just going to follow suit with that. So, what actually happened with the Marshall Plan? Well, first off, George C. Marshall was then Secretary of State, and he's the one who's going to kind of author this plan. And Marshall wants to resuscitate Germany's economy, but he's certainly in the minority opinion for this. A lot of people were perfectly fine with kind of keeping them down and not necessarily giving them their industrial capacity back, but he had a different idea. He basically said that instead of stripping their industrial capacity, having them have a healthy economy would actually be a better combatant of communism in Europe than it would be the other way. So he gets the go ahead to meet with Stalin, and as you might imagine, that does not go very well. So he meets with Stalin, and we have to understand Stalin's point of view in this as well. Stalin was very mindful still of German aggression from World War I and World War II. In his mind, he's like, look, we've seen this movie twice before. It doesn't go well. And so he wanted buffer states between Russia and Germany. He wanted reparations for all the people that he lost, all the money that he lost in World War II. And to be honest, he was also still kind of salty about the fact that the US took its sweet old time opening up a second front in Europe during World War II. He kind of felt like the US left them out to dry. So these are all things that are going to hang up the process. Stalin and Marshall can't get on the same page, and so they leave with no agreement. And so Marshall comes back. He gives an address at Harvard University's commencement in 1947. And although the commencement was certainly the immediate audience, I think the intended audience was probably many of the countries in Europe. And so he basically lays out his plan and what he thinks the US's role should be in this. And for his benefit, the European media covers it and certainly relays that message to other European countries. So not all people in Europe, however, are going to be a fan of this. And so one example of that would obviously be the Soviets. And the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky was probably listening to this speech, and he had a speech a couple months later at the UN where he basically outlined his concerns about the US's potential economic domination of Eastern Europe through a plan like this. So they kind of aired out their grievances, but it didn't ultimately matter because Congress acted and pushed through the Marshall Plan the following year in 1948. And basically, what it stipulated is that we were going to send tons and tons of money through grants to European countries to help them get back up on their feet. And that's an important part to remember is the fact that much of this money is through grants, and so therefore it's not really meant to be paid back. That's a question that I get a lot. When did this finally get paid back, et cetera? And it didn't because it was granted to these countries. So, what are the results of this particular plan? 16 or so countries are going to end up participating. It certainly reinvigorates European industrialization and helps investment return to the region. And we know this because European economies were growing at absolutely crazy rates for the next 3 to 4 years after the plan was implemented. So it was certainly effective. And although there certainly was a measure of goodwill involved, that's not the complete story either. This was certainly a benefit for the Americans because it provided American markets in Europe. So now that people in Europe were starting to have some money, they could now buy American products, and that would help stimulate the American economy. And we also get some free publicity out of it because we more or less told the countries in Europe, hey, if you're receiving this aid, put in a good word for us in the whole American capitalist system, make us some favorable propaganda, all that type of stuff. So those are some of the immediate results. A slightly longer term result is going to be the Berlin blockade. And this basically comes out of the fact that the US helped introduce a new currency in Germany, the Deutschmark. And that was the goal there was to help stabilize the economy. But Stalin didn't see it that way. From his point of view, he basically thought this was a massive threat to his control of Germany because he thought that it would cause massive inflation because all the older currency of the Reichsmark, which is now devalued, would flood over to Eastern Germany and basically create this massive inflation problem for him. So he viewed this as an out and out attack on communism and was not a huge fan. So as a result, he blockades West Berlin, and as a result of that, we initiate the Berlin airlift, which will have to be another topic that we talk about another time. And this more or less solidifies the Eastern and Western blocs. So, as you can also see from this map, all the countries that accepted aid were from Western Europe, not Eastern Europe. So the Soviet satellite countries were not allowed to accept through this plan. How does this impact us moving forward out of this time period? Well, first of all, there's definitely some change. If we look backwards a little bit, this plan was certainly a departure from post-World War I international policy in the sense that if we think about what happened after World War I, yes, the US dealt a bit with the Treaty of Versailles, and yes, it participated in the Dawes Plan, but it largely retreated into isolationism after this. And it largely took a hands-off approach to the Bolshevik revolution that was happening in Russia at the time. However, after World War II, it's very clear that we are getting very involved and we are playing more of an interventionist role in European politics and economies through both the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And the second change here is decolonization. So, again, with many of the European countries being in shambles at this point economically, countries like Britain are going to be forced to give up their colonies in places like Africa and Asia that they've held onto for years and years and years prior to this. So this is going to set up an environment for new countries, specifically the US and the USSR, to attempt to sway the newly independent or newly formed countries to their preferred side or their preferred ideology. But there are certainly some continuities as well. And the first continuity that we've kind of already talked about is this idea of containment. And so this certainly, the Marshall Plan certainly falls under the umbrella of containment. So it had been preceded by the Truman Doctrine. It's going to be followed by other things like the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, and the Eisenhower Doctrine. All of those actions are going to come out of this mindset of we need to stop the spread of communism. And then finally, it's going to be a similarity that we are continuing to sour our relationship with the Soviets. And so the currency issue at the heart of the Berlin blockade certainly drove a wedge deeper between the Soviets and the Americans, and basically our inability to decipher actions from the other's perspective is going to continue to lead to this anxiety and this angst between the two countries moving forward into the Cold War.